Today we have Myron joining us. He's going to discuss a common topic that we receive questions on. That's access to capital, and it's one of the limiting factors that we feel new and beginning farmers and entrepreneurs face. So for the next few moments, I am going to launch a poll. If everyone would participate in the poll, it just gives us a little more information about the attendees that are on today's session. And if it lets me, I'm not sure why. Okay, so
Which one do you want to launch? Pre-survey session
pre-survey number
session
6.
6.
Yep, that's why I couldn't find it. Perfect. So take a few moments to complete the survey, and Myron will give us an idea of when people have started to participate. And we'll take about 5 minutes to do this, and then we will kick off the session with Myron. Myron, you can give us a brief introduction, and then we can continue on.
Sure. So while the panel's going, which I see some people popping in, and I see that, there's a couple that have come in and all the above. My name's Myron Thurston. I am a supply chain specialist. I'm also currently serving as the interim meat processing specialist for New York State. But where I fit much better in this conversation is I review grants for the USDA in my free time. Have done, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 different grants now for the USDA. And so, some feedback on things that I look for as a reviewer. And now that I've done enough of these and looked at scoring, I can feel confident that other reviewers see the same thing. So we've got 5 people that have responded. So I think that's everybody. And 4
Great.
out of those 5 are all of the above, and 1 out of the 5 is grants.
Awesome. Great. So I am going to shut my video off so that we can focus all of our attention on Myron. Thanks again for doing today's session, and we look forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you. Mary Ellen invited me in. I do this presentation quite a bit around the state. So 2 weeks ago, I was with Farm Credit East, speaking with them, and I've done a similar presentation for FarmNet, et cetera. And so thought it would be a great idea to come in and talk with all of you as you look at all these different facets through this grant program and this series of presentations. I will say that most of what I'm going to talk about today is grants, but that there are a lot of resources out there around access to capital in general. And what most of them are going to start with, and Mary Ellen, I know, agrees with me on this, is a business plan. So it's very difficult to get a grant or any other type of capital without having a written business plan. Now, what do I mean by a written business plan? It could be something as simple as you taking a piece of paper and just writing down what your plans are, or it could be something much more comprehensive through something like Ag Plan, or through the resources that you can get from the Small Business Development Center. So we at Cornell Cooperative Extension are not allowed to actually write your business plan for you, but we can refer you to a bunch of different resources out there of people that are happy to do that. When we talk about the Small Business Association, which is where the Small Business Development Center lives, they are there as a free service. So it's not like you'd have to pay anything to go to a Small Business Development Center and get help with your business plan. As well as there's another organization under the SBA called SCORE, and that used to be all retirees, corporate retirees, but it tends to be a large group of people now. And they are allowed to be matched up with you one-on-one as a mentor to help you through things like business planning and stuff like that. Then, when we look at resources around access to capital that are not grants, we have traditional loans, which are going to come from places like Farm Credit East, your local bank, or the USDA Farm Service Agency. And obviously there's lots of other options out there like that. And then, what we're going to talk about today is access to capital from the perspective of grants. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So like I said, this is something that I've done, for other organizations. So there's a lot of information in here. I'm going to go through it reasonably quickly because we have 45 minutes, as I want to leave time for questions at the end. So the first thing to know is that agricultural and farming grants are very different from other grants. I worked in not-for-profits for 15 years. I was in charge of fundraising, so I wrote a lot of grant applications. Usually when you're a not-for-profit, you tell the granting organization that you're going to do something, they think it's a good idea, and then they send you money. Unfortunately, I always like to get this out of the way up front, with agriculture, that usually are not set up that way. There are some small grants under $10,000 that will just send you a check, but it's very, very uncommon for that to happen. Usually how these grants are set up is that they're reimbursable. And usually, not always, it is a reimbursement for a percentage of your cost. So what is a reimbursable grant? A reimbursable grant is one where you receive the funds only after you've incurred the costs. So this means you pay for the project initially, and then the grantor pays you back the funds that you've already spent. So let's say you apply, because we're going to talk about this in a little bit, for a value-added producer grant, which is one where I've seen multiple farmers take advantage of. There's some stipulations on what you use the money for, but for the most part, just think, I have a value-added product and I want to market it and sell it in a different market. How would I go about doing that? The way the value-added producer grant is set up, and we'll talk about the maximum limits, but it's a 50% reimbursable grant. So what would happen, now let's say you got a planning value-added producer grant for, I don't know, $50,000. That means every time that you spent an allowable expense on that grant, you would take your receipt, you would submit it to the USDA. The USDA would say, yep, that was part of your project, and then they will reimburse you 50% of what you spent. So as you can imagine, a $50,000 value-added producer grant would mean that the government is going to reimburse you $50,000 and you're going to spend $50,000 out of pocket. So I always like to talk about that up front. Can be a little discouraging. It's kind of like ripping the Band-Aid off. There are opportunities out there for farmers, but just not in the way you would normally think about, my friend works for this community not-for-profit and they just get free money all the time. As I mentioned, the business plan for the farm and other agricultural businesses will need to be submitted with the application for most grants. Again, you don't have to have something super complicated. Basically, think about it. If you were going to go for a loan and you wanted to get money towards your business, what would you have to show? You'd have to show that your business is stable, that you have a plan for the future, that you've planned for bad things that might happen with your farm. So those are the kinds of things that you would include in your business plan. And that way you can share it with the farm service agency if you were to go there, or Farm Credit East, or whoever. A budget and realistic projection of grant deliverables are critical. So let's say we'll use the value added product example. You have this super awesome corn salsa that your grandma made and you want to sell it, right? Maybe you're already selling some from your farm store, but you'd really like to label them properly and sell them further out than that, right? So what would be grant deliverables for that and realistic projections? Well, you're probably not going to sell 10,000 bottles or jars, maybe you would, but probably not, of the corn salsa in the first month, let's say, right? Highly unlikely. So if you put that in as your projection in the grant, and I'm a grant reviewer and I'm looking at that, I'm like, oh man, there's no way that they're going to sell 10,000 units in the first month based on what I see in this application. So being realistic about the projection, and then the grant deliverables, I suggest that people be slightly not creative, that you be realistic and something that you can reach, right? So let's say that we'll continue to use the value-added producer. You're going to try to get into 5 new farmers markets, right? Is that realistic? How many farmers markets are in your county? How many farmers markets are nearby? How would you go about doing that? If 5 is the number you pick, just make sure that you have a reason why that number 5 was picked as the number of markets you're going to now have your corn salsa in. So then we think about preparing for a grant. you're going to want to get some sort of a plan on paper. It's interesting. I'm working on a grant with our Oneida County Public Market right now, and that's what I was working on this morning before doing this call, is getting a plan on paper. Doesn't have to be pretty, doesn't have to be even spelled right or in proper word order or punctuation or any of that kind of stuff. Just get something out there, get it out of your head and onto paper so that you can start adjusting it from there. You're going to need financial statements. So this doesn't really matter whether you're seeking a grant or applying for a loan. All of them are going to have some sort of a document that says cash flow. Supplement this with a balance sheet, which will summarize your existing debt and the value of assets. So when we talk about cash flow, that's how much money is coming into and going out of your business. Traditionally, farming tends to be very cyclical, right? So a lot of expenses in the spring, and maybe you're recouping most of those costs in the fall. So how you budget your cash flow, especially in agriculture, could be really important. And then keeping records, this is going to help with the grant management if you do get a grant. So grant rating basics, these are things that when I'm teaching, or when I was in the not-for-profit area and I was teaching new grant writers, this is some things that I would tell them to do up front. So you're going to want to read the request or call for proposals carefully. We're going to talk about some of the resources that are out there, say for USDA grants, which make it a lot easier. But if you're going for other grants, you want to see what it is that funder wants to do. We're going to talk about the John May Farmer Safety Fund, which is a small grant through an organization called NICAM later on this afternoon. But their goal is safety on the farm. So if you're going to write a grant to the John May Safety Fund, then you're going to want to make sure you focus whatever you're doing on safety. And let's be realistic, almost anything that you're doing on a farm has some sort of a safety component to it. Going to want to follow the instructions. And I know that sounds easy, right? Follow the instructions. But if you don't, a lot of grants, if you don't submit all the documentation that they need, or you don't do something that they want, especially when we talk about USDA, you don't get another shot at it. They don't call, they don't reach out to you and say, hey, you forgot to whatever. They just reject your application. Going to study the evaluation criteria. So for example, with this farmers market grant that we're working on right now, I know that the USDA under this particular program is really looking for diversity and helping people who are economically and socially disadvantaged, right? So as I start building the grant itself, I'm constantly keeping in my mind, like, what are those criteria that they're going to score me on? And I want to make sure I focus the grant application on those criteria. Going to want to start early. So in the case of this grant that I'm working on, it's due in just under a month, about 3 weeks. I'm working on it this week and next week. I want to finish it next week because in our case, we have a lot of levels of approval that this has to go through and some rewrites and stuff. But don't think that you're necessarily, unless it's like this John May Farmer Safety Fund, which is simple, going to be able to write a grant in a couple of days. It usually is going to take a few weeks or more. And then make an outline, which is actually another thing I was working on this morning. What are the major components of that grant application? What are the areas that you're going to have to write something out? Get all that onto a Word document so that you're not trying to fill it in the grant application itself. So, be organized and articulate. But the big thing here that I always like to point out is when I'm reviewing grants for the USDA, there is a very hard rule that you cannot cross, which is if somebody uses something in their application that you don't know what it is. So let's say it's an acronym, they refer to something that you're not familiar with, whatever, you're not allowed to use the internet, period. And they do that so that no one gets an unfair advantage, meaning if you use an acronym that I don't understand as a grant reviewer, I have to pretend that section doesn't exist. Because otherwise, how could you read through it and not know what the acronym is and make it make sense? So I always recommend having someone that doesn't know anything about the field that you're in read through the grant application before you submit it and tell you if there's any parts that they don't understand. Some of the grant reviewers that I work with now as a panel chair, it might be the first time they've ever reviewed a grant, right? So you always have to keep that in mind. Most grants are going to be competitive grants. Almost all USDA grants that you'll have access to are competitive grants. So part of the process is convincing the reader of that grant that they should fund the project. In the case of the USDA, what they tell us as the reviewers is if this was your tax, well, it is your tax money technically, but if this was actually your money or you think about it as your tax money, would you want to spend it on this particular project? Also ask questions if allowed. Almost every USDA grant will have a training session associated with that USDA grant where you can go and learn more about the grant, and there will always be a mechanism to where you can ask questions. And then have it reviewed for spelling and grammar mistakes. It is really easy for us as humans. When we read, we don't necessarily, I don't know if anybody's ever done the experiment where they only keep the first and last letter of a word the same and you can still read a paragraph with just that. We skip over the mistakes that we make ourselves. I do it all the time. You know what the word is supposed to be that's in there, so you read it as that word. Having someone else look it over at the end, or even just running it through a spell checker and grammar checker like in Microsoft Word, again, why it's nice to put your application there, can be helpful. Don't need you to read all the stuff on this slide. This is just some of the programs at the USDA that are included in just the local food supply chain. So I do, I don't want to overwhelm you with, there are so many grants out there, but it does help to reach out to extension professionals, your local USDA rep, maybe with Farm Service Agency or National Resources Conservation Service, and ask them on what grants might work for you. We're going to talk about a couple of these today, and a bunch of them wouldn't be applicable at all. I just wanted to kind of give you guys the scope just around food supply chain that's out there. So when we look at grants, I'm going to talk about USDA grants here, but it is a very similar timeline for all grants. And that is, there's a pre-award phase. So that's when you find out about the grant. The two grants that we're going to talk about today are going to, both of them are due in the relatively near future. So you find out what the due date is and what that grant is supposed to be for and how you might have a project that would fit in with the goals of that grant. And then you're going to submit your application. And then in the case of the USDA, it could be several months before you hear back. So what I tell people is if you have a project that you need to do next week, not a good grant project. If you have a project you'd like to do next year, could very well be a good grant project. So now pre-award phase is done and you just got a letter in the mail that said, hey, you won. You got some money from the government coming. What they're also going to send you with that letter is all of the terms of the grant. So as we talked about value-added producer grant, they're going to tell you we're only going to reimburse 50% for these type of expenses. If something in your world has changed or you decide that you don't have the money to put up front, then there's always an opportunity to back out at that point. You do not have to sign the grant letter. But if you do, that's when you can start spending money. So as soon as you, and usually there's a notary required, but as soon as you sign that letter in the presence of a notary, you can go ahead and start expending funds out of that grant. So now we're on to the award phase. You're going to have to apply for reimbursements, and then the federal agency staff has to review that and approve it. And so, you're going to have hopefully high quality, fair, and unbiased decisions around the award phase. Then there is always a post-award phase, and what that post-award phase entails is all of the reporting that you have to do for that grant. So we talked about a value-added producer grant, and you're doing grandma's corn salsa recipe, and you want to get to 5 new markets with that corn salsa. So now you have to track those 5 markets that you've been to, the dates you've been there. That's a pretty simple outcome that you have to hit. A lot of them are more complicated. So it makes sense as you're going through the grant to keep track of all this stuff so you're ready for the post-award phase. I also want to call out that there are quite a few programs now specifically for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. And it's actually carved out money. I have the Black Farmers Collective. They are a great group that helps minority farmers with things like grant applications or farming. There's veterans in agriculture and there's women in agriculture. Each of these do have specific carve-outs. So what does that mean? In the case of many USDA grants, there will specifically be money set aside for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. So this is the USDA's definition of a socially disadvantaged farmer and rancher. It's those belonging to groups that have been subject to racial or ethnic prejudice. So those are going to be Black or African American farmers, American Indian or Alaska Native, Hispanic or Latino, Asian or Pacific Islander, and for some, but not all, but it is a good chunk of those. This category also includes women. USDA administers several programs to benefit the socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. There are guaranteed loan funds, a bunch of different stuff that's out there. So if you look up USDA socially disadvantaged farmer, you can find all sorts of information about what's available specifically to those groups. So I'm going to show you what, and you'll see that this shows 2023, so pay no attention to the dates on these because I put this presentation together originally quite a while ago. If you were to click this now, it shows as open and it's again due, I think, on May 14th this year. So this is the value added producer grant. This is what the page is going to look like that you would go to, and you can see that there's a link for a fact sheet, Federal Register notice, and the grants.gov posting. It's going to give you an overview of the grant, which we'll look at in just a moment, how you apply and who you would contact with questions. And I believe Mary Ellen will be sending this out after. You can also just click the link in this presentation. So let's start with what the fact sheet looks like. Basically every, I've never run into a USDA grant that did not have a fact sheet. So it's going to give you a really simple overview of that grant. Who's eligible? How do I get started? What can I use the money for? How much money can I ask for? All that kind of stuff. It's usually 1 to 2 pages, and I recommend that that's the first link that you click when you get to the page. Then you're going to go down and look at what does this grant do? What the most important pieces here are you may receive priority if you're in these areas. So beginning farmer or rancher, socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher, small and medium-sized farm or ranch structured as a family farm, farmer or rancher cooperative in a mid-tier value chain. The next thing that's important to look at is what the program funding amount is and the maximum grant amount. So in the case of the value-added producer grant, planning grants are up to $75,000 and working capital grants are up to $250,000. You can see what the matching fund requirements are. Cost share match requirement of 100% of the grant amount required for all applications. So that makes the 50% that we talked about. They give you 50,000 and then you have to put in 50,000. Who may apply? This is another really important thing because a lot of USDA grants are not for individual producers. So you can see under value added producer grant, the first thing that they list is independent producers as people that can apply. They'll tell you a little bit about how the funds can be used and then how do I get started. Now, if you go to grants.gov, you can see what this page looks like, or what the value-added producer grant looks like. Again, pay no attention to the 2023 dates. But this is what the page on grants.gov is. Grants.gov is where you would go to apply for all federal government grants. And it takes a couple of weeks to get an account set up. It's free. So I strongly recommend if you're ever interested in applying for a grant, go to grants.gov. Don't look it up in Google because there are other companies that will charge you to get a grants.gov number. You want to just go grants.gov. Right on the front page, it'll say, how do I sign up? Click the link. It'll take you about 5 minutes to fill the paperwork out, and you can get set up with a grants.gov account because that's where the actual application takes place. So you can see here that this particular grant, you can see all of the information that you're going to have to fill out and do. You can look at the Federal Register, which is not very exciting. It's just how the money is allocated. I don't necessarily look at them, but you can if you want. Then it's going to give you all the required documents in a zip, and then it's going to give you a toolkit. So in the case of the value-added producer grant, there's a planning grant and a working capital grant, and the toolkits are going to be different for each. I want to bring up another type of grant that you will see on USDA or on grants.gov, and that is what's called relending programs. So this is called the Rural Micro Entrepreneur Assistance Program. What I want to draw your attention to is who may apply for this program: not-for-profits, federally recognized tribes, institutions of higher education, and who is available to qualify for the loan itself. So what would happen is with this particular program, the USDA allocates money to this lending program, and then places can apply to host that lending program. Then you, as a farmer, go to apply to one of those places that's hosting that lending program. In the case of here in Oneida County, we have an organization called Mohawk Valley Edge, which does take advantage of this particular program. So what would happen is you would go to Mohawk Valley Edge, you would say, hey, I want to apply for the Rural Micro Entrepreneur Assistance Program relending. They would say, great. And you have a business with 10 or fewer full-time employees. You're in rural areas outside of town with a population of fewer than 50,000 residents, and lender may be located anywhere. So you'd go to Mohawk Valley Edge, you'd say, hey, I'd like to get this loan. Their terms are pretty solid. And then what happens is you pay your money back to a pool that then can be lended out again. That's why they call it a relending program. So let's say Mohawk Valley Edge gets $5 million to lend out. They do it in, I don't know, $50,000 increments. As each $50,000 loan is paid back, that reimburses the balance, and then they can continue to give out those $50,000 loans. This is the one that we're actually working on right now here at CCE Oneida for the Oneida County Public Market. It's called the Local Food Promotion Program. These grants, there's 3 of them. They're all called LAMP. There is the Local Food Promotion Program, the Farmers Market Promotion Program, and the Regional Food Systems Promotion Program. This is what the pages look like for these types of grants, but you can see all applicants must be domestic entities owned, operated, and located within the 50 states. And then agricultural businesses and cooperatives are the very first listed here under eligible, meaning that you could potentially apply for this. Grants are due mid-May. And these funds you can see here are to develop and coordinate and expand local and regional food business enterprises that engage as intermediaries in indirect producer to consumer marketing. So what does that mean? If you have a farm store, so we had an employee here that lives out in Rome. She just left to work full time on her farm. They started a small farm store that's done really, really well. So what are they doing? They're taking goods from the local community along with their own milk and cheese curds, which they're making on their farm, but they're also bringing in all sorts of stuff from elsewhere in the area for people to buy in one location. So they are engaging as intermediaries in indirect producer to consumer marketing, right? Because they're marketing their store, not the individual products in their store. And then when somebody comes in, they can find a farm good that they never would have seen otherwise. So their project fits very well for something like the Local Food Promotion Program. In the case of what we're applying for here, it's going to be making the farmers markets in Oneida County more inclusive, more welcoming to both socially disadvantaged individuals, minorities, and getting more people to have the opportunity to show their goods in a farmer's market. This one is one that I bring up just because I know we have a lot of dairy out there. I don't know if we have any dairy in this group, but this is called the Dairy Business Innovation Initiatives. Again, I don't know if we have any organic farmers, but if you do, this is a pretty simple program. It's called the Organic Certification Cost Share Program, and it will cover up to 75% or $750 per category for you to list your goods as organic or get them actually certified as organic. So if you do happen to have organic and you need to get a certification, I strongly suggest you check this program out. This is one that's pretty accessible as long as you're an organic farmer. This is actually my favorite area of the USDA. It's called the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. It's very accessible to farmers, but it's specifically to do a few different things. So there is the High Tunnel Initiative, the Organic Initiative, Air Quality Initiative, Landscape Conservation, On-Farm Energy, and then obviously we're not worried about the Colorado River Basin Salinity Project. But the High Tunnel Initiative is a really cool one. I have come across now dozens of hoop houses or high tunnels that have qualified for this particular funding stream. So basically, you fill out the application, the USDA sends somebody out from the National Resources Conservation Service, you show them where you want to put the hoop house with a realistic budget, and they pay for it. So it's not 100%, but it is pretty close to 100% of the overall costs. I think it's up to 10,000, and I think average high tunnels are anywhere between 10 and 12,000. So there may be a little bit that you're responsible for at the end. High tunnels extend growing season, and that's why the National Resources Conservation Service is interested in it. But it's a pretty cool program that I encourage you to check out, and we can take a look at more if I see we've got a couple questions when we get to the end. Also, the New York State Department of Ag and Markets does do some funding for agriculture. This is their funding opportunities page, and you can see there's farming, farmers market, milk and dairy, business development, animals, food safety, plant and natural resources. These are not quite as accessible for farmers, I'll say up front. And even though we have a lot of agriculture in New York, that isn't necessarily the focus of the New York State government when they pick where grant funds are going to go. Though we have had some luck here recently, mainly because of COVID and people finding that there was a lack of access to food. So like the Ag and Markets has done a grant for meat processors that we just finished. And then there's going to be a grown and certified grant coming out soon. If you're a grown and certified farmer, you can get up to $50,000 towards farm improvements. All grant opportunities with New York State go through something called Grants Gateway. And there's a link down here when you get this presentation. You can click to go look at the funding opportunities and learn more about Grants Gateway. They've actually they're in the process of switching over to a new vendor. I don't know if it takes you directly there or not, but you can see all that on the page with that link at the bottom. This is a Urban Farms and Community Gardens grant program. I believe this one just closed, but I wanted to give you an idea of what these look like when you get there. So you have the overview of what they're trying to do, a description of what these funds are going to be focused on, and in this case, community growing spaces that play a critical role in combating food insecurity. It will give you all the information to apply. So this is what the pages look like on grants.gov. Or not grants.gov, I'm sorry, the New York State website. Empire State Economic Development is another area where I encourage people to consider. I know that usually people, when they farm, they think, well, I'm not creating jobs. It's just me and my spouse maybe that work on the farm. Well, if you and your spouse are able to quit your full-time jobs and work on the farm, that's 2 new jobs you've created, right? Because you're both working there now. If you have to hire on help during certain parts of the year, if they're working 10 hours a week, 4 of them equals a full-time employee, right? So it doesn't matter that they're not an actual full-time employee, if their time is adding up to a full-time employee, you can get small business credits. And I strongly encourage people to check it out. But there are both a value to hiring, and I'm going to use a term that is not meant to be derogatory, but low skill workers, those are positions that can be hired. It's the term New York State uses. That means that they can be hired directly out of high school. They don't need any specialized training to come work on your farm. Here in Oneida County, there is the opportunity to get up to $15,000 per new hire as a grant towards something you're doing with your business. In addition to that, Empire State Economic Development can provide things like tax relief. They can freeze your taxable amount on your property, a bunch of different stuff like that. So even though maybe as a farmer you don't jump in and say, oh, geez, that's totally something that Empire State Economic Development would be interested in, you do want to think about your farm as a business. Empire State Development does have a small section on agribusiness. And you can see here, these are what are offered to all businesses through Empire State Development. So you have your tax incentives. They will provide ongoing operational support, growth support, so funds and loans for growing your business, and innovation development support. This is another grant program that I like to bring up to people. National Resources Conservation Service does have some grants around on-farm energy, but this is a really cool one with National Grid, and most power companies now are doing this. So basically, they will help replace things on a farm to make them more energy efficient. So I always think I grew up in a 150-year-old dairy barn. As you can imagine, not very much energy efficient. I think we still had one of those like Thomas Edison light bulbs that never burns out in there somewhere. So though we didn't take advantage of this program, a farm like ours could have to say replace all of those old light bulbs with LED lights. And so you see here energy efficiency lighting, ballast fixtures and lighting controls. Ventilation fans, that's another thing that can be very expensive on farms if you do have animals that you're keeping in a barn. Process equipment, renewable energy projects like anaerobic digestion, solar, biomass and hydropower. In addition, costs that include a cost associated with renovating, retrofitting customer distribution systems such as wiring and grounding. So, you know, if you do have an older barn on your property and you're housing animals in it, there could be an opportunity for you to get low or no cost new lighting for your barn. I also want to bring up this grant. There's not a ton of grants available throughout the country. 50 farmers and ranchers get $5,000 each with the National Young Farmers Coalition and their partnership with Chipotle. But what's really cool is this is just a great organization. I'm sure that Mary Ellen has talked to you guys or will talk to you guys about the Young Farmer, National Young Farmer Coalition. It's a really cool opportunity to, if you are a young farmer, to find peers out there to talk to. But they also do have these grants and cohorts as well. And then we have the John May Farm Safety Fund, which is what I talked about at the very beginning. This is through Bassett Healthcare Network and the New York Center for Agricultural Medicine and Health, which we call NICAM. And it's all about safety. But what I tell farmers is, what are you doing on your farm that has nothing to do with safety, right? If you're putting in a new gate for your animals, well, that new gate's going to be a heck of a lot safer than the old gate, right? If you're putting down new flooring because there's a pit in the cement, that's safety related. If you're, you know, anything that you're doing around the farm can be spun to sound like it's safety related. This one is a 50-50, so you pay 50% of the project costs, and John May Farm Safety Fund pays the other 50%, and they pay up to $5,000 with this grant program. All right, so that is a whole bunch of information. I will pop off share now. And I think we've got some questions.
We do. And Myron, if you can make it so I can share my video, I can't share now. So we do have a couple questions. What if you have already spent the money up front, like buying land and etc.? Will they take that in effect?
So no, the way it works out is once you're assigned a grant, once you've been awarded a grant, it's only post-award expenses. And I just went through this with that meat processing grant that I worked very closely on. And at the end of the day, even though the process moved pretty quickly, we were still 6 months from beginning to end, right? By the time we had announced who the winners were, I'd had at least a dozen calls of like, hey, can I just go ahead and do this? And it's like, no, you got to wait till that letter is signed. So not retroactive, but let's say you already have the land and you want to put a structure on it, right? Maybe it is a grant for that, or maybe you're going to the Farm Service Agency and saying, hey, I have the land, but I need a storage barn. And they can help you with very low interest rate loans for that.
All right, another question. Is all of this information geared towards farming and agriculture? What is the website for grants?
So there's two different places that you can go. I'll put them in the chat.
And again, I will send out an email to all of the participants today with a copy of Myron's presentation as well as helpful links.
So grants.gov is the main one that you're going to go to. You can search there. It's going to show every government grant that you could possibly have. But I will also say that very much Google is your friend. So if you type in grant, USDA, and then plug in whatever it is that you want to do, that could be another way to search online. Google's pretty good at finding what you wouldn't necessarily find just surfing through the USDA website. And then the other is grants and loans from on the USDA. This is going to give you just a laundry list of some of the different stuff that we've talked about today. And then
we'll leave a couple minutes open for additional questions if anyone has them.
And then this is the New York State agriculture funding opportunities. As far as foundation grants, or if you're wanting to look for grants that aren't government grants, that really comes down to, I tell people just Google search, see what you come up with, and try to find them that way. That's usually how I identify grants, even with 20 years of experience in the field. Yeah, Doris, and if you start to get into these and you have a follow-up question, please feel free to email me and I can point you in the right direction if there's something you're looking for and you can't find. Take my hundreds of hours of experience on these stupid websites and, don't make the headache for yourself, but they're pretty self-explanatory once you get there. Like they're going to have a list of all the different stuff to look at, click through the links and everything.
And yes, this presentation will be available later. We have recorded this presentation and it will be available to view on our YouTube channel, CCE Oneida.
All right, is there any other questions from the group? I know I went over a lot and you may have follow-up once you've gone through the presentation again and click some of the links. But is there any other questions you have for me today? Oh, is there one more in the Q&A? Yes, Doris. Yes, that's right. We've talked before, so you're good.
All right, so if there's no more questions, our next session is May 7th at noon. We will be having Marty Butts join again, and he will be discussing running a great farmers market booth. It's definitely an exciting topic with the sun shining and getting forward to our farm market season. Again, we look forward to you joining our next session on May 7th. And if you can please complete the survey at the end of this session today, it just gives us additional information for future programming. We'd like to thank Myron for joining. And if anyone has additional questions, once this session has ended, please feel free to reach out to me and we'll be following up. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for having me, Mary Ellen. Have a great day
Thanks,
as well.
Myron.